now let's get into some fly tying materials, starting off with hackle. Now, what is hackle? Hackle is the term used to describe feathers from a bird, usually chickens. And dry hackle is feathers from a rooster or a male chicken, while soft hackle is used to describe chicken feathers from a hen, female chicken. Now let's start off with dry hackle. Now, a dry hackle neck is one of the most prized possessions a fly tyer could even own. Dry hackle is called this because it is very hydrophobic. The feathers are very hydrophobic, more so than any other feather, really. In fly tying, we would say that these feathers aren't webby. Now, what does webby mean? Webby is a term in fly tying used to describe something that is flimsy and absorbent. The easiest way to find this webbiness is to take a feather off the pelt and hold it up to a light. Now, from the base of the feather to the tip, you should see a tapered section going along the quill of the feather. That there is what we call webbiness. This will not help your fly float. Now back to dry hackle, or rooster capes. These feathers have the least amount of that webbiness on the spine of the feather compared to any other feather. Now, if you're curious as a first-time buyer of what company has perfected this through the breeding of chickens, it would have to be Whiting. Whiting has perfected that lack of webbiness in their feathers for decades. But they are also very expensive. So if you're on the lower end, get a Metz cape. It is just as good. That's METZ. Now, if you look at a rooster feather, you will notice that it has a few qualities. One of them is being thin and long. What this means is that on certain feathers, on a rooster cape, you can make multiple dry flies with it. A feather from a hen can really only make you one fly at a time, but Whiting has perfected this where they make extremely long feathers, which you can then make multiple flies out of. So that is one quality of rooster hackle, is that it's long and thin. So let's move on to soft hackle. Soft hackle is a term used to describe feathers or a neck from a hen, a female chicken. Now, this term soft hackle isn't exclusive to just hens. You can also find soft hackle on a pheasant, among other birds, although pheasant feathers are usually not used for dry flies. As opposed to rooster hackle, soft hackle is all webby. The entire feather is webby, hence the name soft hackle. Because they are webby and absorbent, they will have a lot of movement in the water. Think back to those wet flies and streamers. Unlike rooster fibers that stick out straight and are pretty stiff, soft hackle is very webby and flimsy, like I said. Another trait of soft hackle is the shortness of the feather. As opposed to rooster hackle, which is long and thin, soft hackle is short and wide. Again, the company that has perfected this webbiness is Whiting. They provide the longest and widest feathers for soft hackle. But again, as a first-time buyer, if you can't afford a Whiting soft hackle, go for instead a Metz soft hackle. It should be a bit cheaper. Now let's talk about thread. Oh boy. I'll be honest, it took me a year to realize the importance of size of thread. Color is not so much as important as size. So let's talk about color, the easy part. If you're a first-time buyer, I would recommend getting black thread and a spool of white thread as well. If you so choose to invest more, then you can get a variety pack of natural colors. So that includes colors from white to black. It includes grays, browns, tans, oranges, greens, olives, and so on. If you so choose to get that, you honestly won't need much more thread colors than that. Secondly, size, the important part. Like everything in fly tying, for some odd reason, different companies have different sizing. So if you're a first-time buyer, just stick to one company's sizing chart. It will save you a lot of stress and you can start to become confident a lot quicker with your thread. Although if you do need a cross-reference chart, then Orvis and other companies have made cross-reference charts. So for me, I chose aughts, specifically 6/0 and 8/0 thread. Aught sizing goes from 18/0 all the way down to 3/0. But again, it has to be confusing because larger the number, thinner the thread. So 18/0 is the thinnest thread you can get in the aughts, and 3/0 would be the thickest thread that you can get in the aughts. So let's go over what flies you should be tying with what size of thread. So all the way at the thinnest for 14/0, you're only going to be tying really, really tiny midges and really, really tiny dry flies. Now let's talk about 8/0. 8/0 you would be using for those small nymphs and small dry flies. For 6/0 you'd just be tying those medium to large size nymphs and those larger flies. So larger dry flies and maybe some streamers as well. For 3/0 you'd be pretty much exclusively using that for saltwater flies, for bass bugs, pike flies, musky flies, stuff like that. So as a first time buyer, I would recommend getting a variety pack of 6/0. And once you start to get a little bit more comfortable with 6/0, then you can move on to 8/0. And at that point, I don't really think you need to go any thinner or thicker. Usually I use 8/0 on everything. But if you're tying those bigger streamers, you probably should get a larger size of thread. So that is thread. Now let's talk about hooks. Hooks will be your limiting factor in fly tying. You will have an abundant amount of every other material but hooks. On the lower end of hooks, the sizes range from 32 to 2 by increments of 2. Above size 2 or 1, you go by aughts. Aughts are shown by fractions, so 1/0 would be 1/0. 32 is the smallest hook size you can buy on the smaller end of hooks. The hooks labeled aughts are the largest you can buy. On the lower end, the larger the number, the smaller the hook. On the larger end, the larger the number, the larger the hook. For trout and for small freshwater fish, you'll usually stay on the smaller end of hooks. In my experience, the average hook size that I use is between 12 and 18. And sometimes you'll buy some streamer hooks on the low end, like a 1/0 or a 2/0. There are also different types of hooks. There are dry fly hooks, wet fly hooks, nymph hooks, emerger hooks, and streamer style hooks. Let's start with dry fly hooks. So dry fly hooks usually have a straight shaft and are the lightest gauge out of all the other hooks. Some variations of dry fly hooks even have hollow tips. That means that some of the metal is hollowed out from the hook point to make it lighter. Just be careful seating those into your vise. Another style of dry fly hook is a clink hammer style hook. These have the back half of the hook bent down into the water. When fished, the back half of the hook is submerged underwater, making a great presentation. Now let's move on to wet fly hooks. Wet fly hooks are similar to nymph hooks because they are both heavier than dry fly hooks, but wet fly hooks tend to be longer and straighter than nymph hooks. Now let's move on to nymph hooks. Nymph hooks are also heavy, like wet fly hooks, but they tend to be shorter and have more curvature. A big variation of the nymph type of hook is the scud hook. Scud hooks have a short, straight section at the front that then tapers into the bend of the hook. Another big variation of nymph hooks are jig style hooks. Jig hooks have a section at the front that is bent down, including the hook eye. These hooks are meant to sport a bead and ride upside down in the water. The final type of hook is a streamer hook. These are the heaviest and longest of all the hook types. They are usually also the strongest to fish with because they are made for really big fish. They tend to be a thick gauge even at small sizes. This is also the hook type that usually has offset hooks. You will find standard hook sizes across all these types. So you can find a size 14 cling hammer, a size 18 jig hook, a size 12 dry fly, and a size 8 streamer. The only exception is that you won't find any dry fly hooks in the aught sizes. I would also like to mention for first time buyers that not all hooks are created equal. Some hooks snap as soon as they hit the vise, and if they don't snap in the vise, then they might snap in a fish's mouth. Just be aware of that. Some hooks are great and sturdy. Some are terrible. So buy quality, strong hooks. I would also like to add another note to this section, an ode to old hooks. Old hooks are an option. I'm gonna make that very clear. I use old hooks, but there have been times where I open up a pack of old hooks and half of them snap before I even start tying because I put them into the vise and immediately snap. So just keep that in mind when you're using old hooks, but I will say they definitely are an option. It's also very interesting because if you compare the gauges of like a modern jig hook and a pretty old nymph hook, the gauges are way different. So it's a small data pool, but in my experience, modern hooks tend to be a little bit stronger for that reason. They're just made with thicker gauges these days. So keep that in mind as well. Now let's talk about lead wire. Lead wire adds weight to a fly. When you go to buy lead wire, you will also see that it's sold in multiple sizes. Like I said, if you're a first-time buyer, just stick to one company's sizing. Remember, small flies, small proportion. Match the lead size to the hook size. Smaller the hook, smaller the wire. You will see that lead wire is usually sold in 0.0x sizes. So 0.01 wire, 0.02 wire, 0.03 wire. The thing to remember is that the higher the number, the higher the gauge of wire. So for 0.05 lead wire, this will be used on very small, tiny nymphs. For 0.01, you'll be using this usually for sizes 14, 16, and below. For 0.02, you'll be using this on large nymphs, maybe small streamers as well. And finally, for 0.03 lead wire, you'll usually be using this on big streamers and above. So that's lead wire. Now let's talk about copper wire. When you're going to look for and buy copper wire, you'll see that they sell it in multiple sizes. These are important because with flies, they are small products. And if they're small products, then they're going to have small proportion changes. Practically speaking, you also don't want to be wasting a lot of extra small wire on a large hook. Copper wire is mainly used to add segmentation and weight. Now, if you're a first-time buyer, you will see that there's many different companies that sell copper wire. If you're a first-time buyer, I would just recommend go to one company's sizing, because for each company, there's going to be a different sizing chart. So stick with one. In this course, I will give you an example of UTC's sizing chart. UTC Ultra Wire, that's the official name, sells wire in sizes extra small, small, medium, and brassy. Now for extra small wire, it's good to be used on dry flies, like very small dry flies, because it's heavy. You don't want it to weigh it down. But this extra small wire is very good for wrapping over hackle to protect it. So the case use of extra small wire is usually just on dry flies. Other than that, they are also used on very tiny nymphs. Next is small wire. This is usually used on flies sizes 16 and below. It is good to add segmentation, it adds a bit of weight, but it's not too heavy. Next, in the size order, not the name order, is size brassy. Now, what is size brassy good for? Brassy flies, specifically adding abdomens on nymphs. It is very good for adding segmentation and weight, especially if the entire abdomen of your fly is going to be copper wire. Size brassy is also good for sizes 16 and above. The final size class is size medium. This is also good for weighing down your flies and adding segmentation, but it's mostly used on sizes 16 and above. It is the thickest wire that UTC sells. Hopefully you're understanding at this point that you should be using different sizes of wire on different sizes of hooks, not only for proportion's sake, but also for practicality's sake. So that is copper wire. Now I want to talk about beads. Beads also add weight. They also add color and shape. There are 3 types of bead materials: plastic, glass, and metal. And they are in that order for how heavy they are. Plastic beads sink slow. Glass beads are next, and metal beads sink the quickest. They usually fall into 2 size categories: by millimeters or by fractions. If you're a first-time buyer, like I said earlier, just stick to 1. There are many charts available online if you need to cross-reference if you have already inherited some beads. Like I said, they also add shape to a fly, so they come in a variety of shapes. The traditional shapes that you'll find are cyclops, jig, conehead, and what I call teardrop. Now, cyclops beads are usually used on traditional style straight hooks and streamers, which are straight hooks. Next are jig beads or slotted tungsten beads. These are used on jig style nymph hooks. Next, there's also the teardrop shaped bead. This is used on either straight hooks or jig hooks. Next is conehead, which are the largest and heaviest of all the beads, and these are used on streamer flies primarily. So that is beads. Alright, let's talk about dubbing now. Dubbing is where you can have a lot of fun in fly tying, and it makes your flies come alive. The most common dubbing is from animal furs: fox, squirrel, hares, and even alpaca. Sometimes natural plant fibers are used as well. There's a lot of variety with dubbing. There's a lot of variety in color and a lot of variety in consistency. Some are good for nymphs, some are good for dry flies. So let's talk about natural fur. If you're a hunter, you'll probably know that most animal furs have underfur and guard hair. Fly tyers use both. When combed out, the underfur can be used as dubbing, and what you're left with is guard hair, which can be used on those elk hair caddises and Goddard caddises and whatnot. Now, if you want a lot of dubbing out of an animal pelt, you want a pelt from an animal that was shot in fall or winter. This is because underfur is used to keep the animal warm and or waterproof. So in fall or winter, they have a lot more underfur, and this is why also animals shed off in summer. If you have a cat or a dog, you'll know this too well. But the opposite is true for guard hair. If you want a lot of guard hair on your pelts and not a lot of underfur, then you would want a pelt from an animal shot in spring or summer when they're shedding off all this underfur. The most common pelts you'll find are from hares, like a hare's mask, like a face from a rabbit, or squirrel, deer, elk, among others. Most of these dubbings will come in natural colors, so you'll get natural grays, dark grays, light grays, you'll get whites, you'll get browns, light browns, tans, stuff like that. In a lot of animal furs, you'll just get these natural colors. So now let's talk about artificial dubbing. I don't use much artificial dubbing, but it definitely comes with a lot of benefits if you're a first-time tyer. One of the benefits is length of fibers. There's usually a limit to how long fibers can be from natural furs. The longest I've seen is from alpaca, and you can barely call that dubbing. That's just long animal furs. But you can get a lot of length with artificial dubbing. I know some ice dub and some saltwater flies come with extremely long dubbing fibers. Another benefit is consistency. So if you're combing out from a hare's mask, let's say, you're going to be getting white dubbing, you're going to be getting tan, dark brown, black dubbing. You're going to be getting a lot of different colors and maybe a lot of different consistencies of dubbing. But with artificial dubbing, you know that the pack will be pretty much consistent all the way through. It'll be the same shade, it'll be the same consistency. You can also have a lot of flash in artificial dubbing. So there's not many natural materials that are naturally shiny or color shift. But with artificial dubbing, like ice dub, you have some flash in the dubbing, which is sometimes very helpful on nymphs. Another benefit to artificial dubbing is that sometimes it's just aesthetically pleasing. Sometimes artificial dubbing goes really well with other artificial materials on flies, and it makes a really cool looking fly. And finally, color. Yes, you can dye artificial furs many different colors, but sometimes you're limited to just bleaching it and then re-dyeing it. And sometimes you can't even bleach it that well. So with artificial dubbing, you can get every color in the spectrum that you want out of artificial dubbing. And like I said, sometimes with natural furs, you're just stuck to the natural colors. So there are some benefits to artificial dubbing for sure. Now, here is a graph that I kind of made for beginners about dubbing. If your dubbing is long fibers and it's very wide fibers, that's pretty good dubbing for streamers. Now, if your fibers are long but very thin, then that dubbing would be really good for dry flies and nymphs as well. Now, if your dubbing is thin fibers but they are short, then that would be really good dubbing for nymphs, generally speaking. But if your dubbing is wide and short, then I think that's too much dubbing. And you can't really use that on a fly. That's if you just take a big old clump out of the pack. That's not going to be good for your dry fly or any fly. But this chart is just a general rule of thumb when it comes to choosing and making and applying dubbing. Now, like I mentioned in the previous section about dubbing, on a pelt there is underfur and guard hair. So now I want to talk about guard hair. This is most easily explained on a dyed piece of deer hair. So let's say you take a clump, you cut it off the pelt at the base, and you comb it out. What you're left with is the guard hair. Now, these individual fibers are hollow, so they naturally want to float and will help your fly float. When you first get into fly tying, you will learn about a pattern called the elk hair caddis and the Goddard caddis. These dry flies both use the floating properties of deer hair and elk hair, along with the color and shape of them. The Goddard caddis is tightly packed deer hair, but with no weight. By adding weight, you remove the floating property of deer hair, but you keep the color and shape. This is how you can create amazing streamer patterns like the muddler. A small note about deer hair and guard hair in general is that sometimes it makes for fantastic tailing fibers. If you tie in a few on the end and split them, and then add a little bit of water to them, they will present as perfectly split V-tails. That's a really cool trait that you can use deer hair for. So that is guard hair. Now let's talk about goose biots. Goose biots come from goose wing feathers. If you can think of a goose feather and how one side has long fibers and one side has short fibers, the side with the short fibers are biots. A biot is just one piece from that side of the feather with the thinner quills. They are stiff and relatively short quills that are tapered. They are usually only a few centimeters to an inch long at most. And of course, the longest feather on the bird would have the longest biots. The main case uses for goose biots are tails on nymphs and dry fly bodies. Why fly tyers like goose biots so much is that they are perfect at imitating that V shape of a nymph tail. And when they're wrapped up on a body in closed spirals, they leave dark segmentations, just like the body of a dry fly. So if you have the shorter ones, the shorter biots, those are better for the nymph tails. If you have longer biots, those are a bit better for the dry fly bodies, or nymph bodies. And that is goose biots. Now I want to talk about a general natural material, duck. Duck feathers are very fun to tie with. The two most common duck materials you'll find in fly tying are wood duck and duck flank. Wood duck is a great feather, and it's most commonly used on dry fly wings and nymph tail and wing cases. The feather is a semi-see-through gray to white feather with bars along the feather. This is why it makes for such great wings, because it has those black bars and the gray color. The segmentation is also great for nymph tails, because it imitates those bars on a nymph's tails really well. It is also webby and a soft hackle, so it absorbs water pretty nicely. Sometimes you'll see people use those feathers for fins on a sculpin pattern. The other duck material is duck flank. This is from a duck's wing, and these quill feathers are hydrophobic. They don't absorb water. So again, they make for very good dry fly wings. They also come in a variety of colors, from gray to black to cream to white to navy blue. There's a lot of varieties of colors, which means if there's whites and grays and blacks and it's hydrophobic, what is it good for? Dry fly wings. So those are the two most common duck materials you're going to find. I thought I'd include this because it is a very good habit to get into of making those wood duck wings, and to just also know about a lesser known, lesser used duck material. So that is duck. Now let's talk about a really cool material, ostrich herl. Ostrich herl is definitely not a necessary material, but it's definitely really useful. It is a fantastic natural material that comes in abundance with just one feather. The ostrich feather is a very unique feather, just like a peacock feather. Along its spine, it has very fluffy and webby herls. This is a great material for nymphs. You will usually find this material dyed in a pack of 1 to 3 feather sections, or you can get the whole feather. For using ostrich herl, you can wrap it up in closed spirals for a really good gill presentation on a nymph, or you can palmer it up a body. Regardless, the edges are so dang webby that it almost presents just like dubbing, but it has a little bit more movement. So that is ostrich herl. Let's talk about peacock herl, one of the only natural materials that is naturally shiny. Peacock herl is mainly used on nymphs, but sometimes it is used on dry flies. It's usually green, but there are some variations that come into a bronze red color. You can either buy peacock herls in a pack of pre-cut herls, or you can just buy the feather. The pack will have many of the same sized herls in the same color, but if you buy the feather, you get a variety of sizes. You have to cut them off, but the eye of the feather is included. So you get those blue herls, you get those interesting yellow herls, you get the black herls, you get all these interesting colors of herls. Now just remember, the peacock herls themselves are tapered. What does this mean? Well, they have very thin, frail tips. So when you tie with them, make sure you snip off those thin tips so you can confidently tie with it without it snapping and stressing you out. Because trust me, I would know. So now let's talk about marabou. Marabou is a material that is used often in streamer flies. It's because it's the webbiest feather known to man. It is extremely webby, which means it moves like crazy in the water. If you want an example of this, look up the fly pattern, the Brahma bugger. This thing is incredible with the movement in the water. It is usually used for tails on streamers because it makes a triangle shape and it moves like crazy, just like a fish's tail. And it can also be bought in a variety of colors. How you will find this in the store is it'll be a pack of feathers strung up together at the base of all the feathers, and you usually buy it in a pack of a specific color. So if you're a first-time buyer, I would recommend getting black or olive marabou. So that's marabou. So now let's talk about tinsel. You could think of tinsel as just flashy string. Tinsel is usually used to add flash and segmentation to a fly. You'll usually just find two kinds of tinsel, oval or flat. You'll also find two traditional colors of tinsel, and that is gold and silver. Oval tinsel is usually a thin rope with a silver or gold coating. Flat tinsel is usually plastic or metal, and it's usually in the color silver, but both are flat and shiny. There are also other types of tinsel that can be flat and shiny, but also be different colors. And then there can also be different colors, of course, of oval tinsel. But the traditional colors you'll find are gold and silver, and the traditional shapes that you'll find are oval and flat. So that is tinsel. Now finally in the materials section, let's talk about head cement. Once you make the finishing knot on a fly, you will need to add some sort of head cement. Now, head cement is a specific product in and of itself. It's also a general term in fly tying to describe the way that you're going to seal that final knot. So that could mean nail polish, head cement, UV resin, among others. There are many brands of head cement, although they're all pretty much chemically similar. You can also seal a fly with UV resin or nail polish. Both leave a shiny finish and have a very strong hold. But it comes down to preference, really, because they all do their job very well. But here are some pros and cons. So for head cement, some pros are that it's very cheap. It has a very strong hold, and it really seeps into the thread wraps. Some cons of head cement, though, are that it's slow to dry. So it'll take about 30 minutes for the head cement to fully dry on the fly. And also the head cement container itself, over time, and by time I mean years, it will dry out. But you will notice it after a while when it doesn't drip off your dubbing needle as quickly. So at that point, you need some thinner. And so this con is that you need to buy some sort of thinning agent. And usually that's right next to the head cement section on the website when you buy it. Now let's move on to nail polish. Some pros to nail polish is that it includes a brush, it leaves a shiny finish, and it's relatively quick to dry. A con, though, is that sometimes they are a bit pricey. Now let's talk about UV resin. Oh boy. UV resin is very, very quick to dry, and this is why it's really convenient to fly tyers. It also leaves a really cool polish finish. People figured this out and they actually started to incorporate it into the patterns themselves. You can find those sometimes online. They're really cool. They make for really good scud backs too. But some cons are that it is expensive because you will need the UV resin itself and a light similar to head cement and head cement thinner. But in this case, there are different holds or different thicknesses or different strengths of UV resin. So there's like the lighter holds, medium hold, heavy hold, and whatnot. So it can be a little bit expensive. And that is head cement. And here again, I'm using head cement as a general term just to describe whatever you use to seal the head. So get yourself some head cement. That's what I would recommend. But if you do want to commit to UV resin or nail polish, it's up to you. It is really up to preference. So let's talk about pheasant pelts. I would recommend to every beginner fly tyer to get a pheasant pelt. The shelf life, the uses, the quality and quantity are well worth the investment. And in my experience, a pheasant pelt pretty much teaches you about every other pelt because usually you get it in totality. Wings, legs, tails, neck, everything. It has soft hackle. It has chickaboo. It has stiff wing feathers, like a duck. It also has the pheasant tails. You can make hundreds of patterns just off of one pheasant pelt. The neck and back feathers are great for soft hackles. They are great for streamers and even nymphs. Another thing about pheasant pelt is that every feather has a natural color shift to it. So like I said, there's not many natural materials that have a natural shininess to them, but almost every feather on a pheasant is shiny. And like I said, the tails on a pheasant can be used for nymph tails or legs on hopper flies. And also in my area, a full pheasant pelt is running you about $35. In my opinion, a pheasant pelt is well worth the investment, especially for a beginner. I'd recommend if you're searching for one, get one with the tails included. You can never have enough pheasant tail. So get a pheasant pelt. That's what I'd have to say.